speakers. We're going to move the pace along fairly quickly. So I'm going to ask the speakers to talk for about 10 minutes each, and then we can have a good conversation with questions and discussion about the issues.
You've got to
and
tell
indeed, the issues are very important ones. Here we are in an ongoing COVID crisis. Yes, the vaccine is on the way, but no one imagines that the economic problems that have been experienced in Australia, as in so many other countries during the last year, are going to disappear overnight. We've got to be thinking about what it would take to create a decent economic recovery, a fairer society, a more sustainable future for us all. And of course, that raises some pretty profound questions about our political system. Is it capable of delivering what we need in these difficult circumstances? So to address these questions, and maybe some more too, we've got Ben Spies-Butcher and Mike Beggs. Mike Beggs is a lecturer at senior lecturer, I should say, in political economy department at the University of Sydney. He's someone I've known for many years because that was my department before I took retirement. And I have to tell you that he's one of Australia's leading political economists. So his thoughts on a topic like this are particularly important. A second speaker will be Ben Spies-Butcher, also well known to me because he, like Mike, did his PhD in political economy at the University of Sydney, and he's currently the chair of the discipline of sociology at Macquarie University. So without further ado, let me first introduce Mike Beggs.
Thanks, Mike. And you want me sitting here so the best of the cameras? Everyone can see me okay? Great. Thanks very much, Frank. I'm really delighted to be here at Politics in the Pub because when I first moved to Australia about 15, 16 years ago as a political economy student, I think I first came to Politics in the Pub to see Frank at the Gaelic Club, sometime around 2005, 2006, and I was a regular there for quite a long time until my daughter was born. I moved away, stopped going to the pub, stopped watching politics, etc. And it's delightful to be here. And I think what's also amazing is the fact that we're actually doing it in a pub. I think at the time Frank invited me last year, it seemed pretty unlikely that we'd be in a pub anytime soon. And I assumed I'd be just doing this through Zoom. So it's really, really nice to be here. And it's weird kind of how almost normal things are seeming again, right? Being here in a pub. So I'm going to ask everybody to cast their mind back to where they were about exactly a year ago, right? When things, the full extent of what we were about to, what was hitting us was becoming apparent. It would have been sometime about this time of year, I think, that it moved from being something that was affecting our lives to something that was massively affecting all of our lives. And around about this time, it would have been last April, I wrote a piece with Beck Pierce in Sociology at ANU that was published in Jacobin. And so what I say today is kind of going to be looking back to that piece. So I have to sort of credit Beck with some of the ideas here. But a year on, in that time we were sort of saying what we thought should happen. And now I'm going to look back and see how what did happen compares. So anyway, cast your mind back to this time about a year ago. We're almost exactly the anniversary to the day of a tweet by Madonna, which there was a lot going on, so you might not remember this particular tweet. It was deleted pretty quickly afterwards. So I'm going to read it out. And she said, the virus doesn't care about how rich you are. It's the great equalizer. And what's terrible about it is what's great about it. But like I used to say at the end of Human Nature every night, if the ship goes down, we're all going down together. And it was kind of received poorly at the time because, in a sense, she was right in that it was certainly about to affect us all. We all were in it together, and the virus sort of revealed our interdependency very starkly. but of course it didn't affect all of us equally. Everybody in this room will have had some kind of experience, and it would have been different depending on where you are in life, how you make a living, and a whole lot of other features. And maybe first of all, it came onto your radar because it affects your travel plans, right? And then maybe the travel bans hit. I mean, that was the first big impact on Australia, and that affected some industries, so universities, for example. And maybe you got an email from a manager, a stern email about how much we're gonna have to tighten our belts. But then before we knew it, within 2 or 3 weeks, it was actually right upon us out there in the community. And then what happened next really depended on what kind of work you did, right? So maybe you were encouraged, and then you were asked to work from home. Maybe you lost hours, maybe you lost shifts, maybe your whole job, maybe your business, because your customers just weren't able to come to your business anymore. But on the other hand, maybe you work in one of the other sectors, like clinics or aged care, supermarkets, food delivery, when all of a sudden work actually intensified, but also became riskier. And then, of course, the schools closed, and somehow you found yourself looking after your kids, and somehow having to fit that in as well. And depending on where you work, that would have been easier or harder. I mean, it was difficult for everybody. But how accommodating your employer was to your workloads would make a big difference. And then the lockdowns were truly in place, a month or two on, and maybe you're at home drawing your regular salary, but just working on Zoom all day. But maybe you're getting some fraction because your employer is eligible for JobKeeper. Maybe you're not eligible because you're on a casual contract, or your particular employer didn't lose enough to be eligible. Or maybe you're on the augmented job seeker, but maybe you're excluded from that because you're a migrant worker. Whatever your case, whatever situation you're in, the same rent was due, or your mortgage payments were still due, and you still had to eat, of course, and make car payments or whatever. Alternatively, some people were on the other side of those payments. You might have got an email from your property manager that the tenants have fallen behind on rent. And maybe that made you, as a mom and dad investor, worried about your own payments due to the bank. Or you might have had other assets in your mind, your super portfolio or shares. Nevertheless, though, I think Madonna was right that what happened revealed how interdependent we were. I mean, remember when you first realized you might be staying at home basically all the time for a couple of weeks, and there was that rush on the supermarkets. We suddenly realized how dependent we all are on other people's labor, and also how dependent we are, of course, on the financial flows. Because capitalism does involve a highly collectivized division of labor. Right? It's very cooperative. We all just play a little part in that, but it highly individualizes our claims on the product of that collective labor. And our incomes, our private incomes, depend very much on the payments of others. And that depends on their inflows. And then those inflows depend on others' payments, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And when there's a big disruption in that network of financial flows, the market bases that people rely upon, most people rely on to live, disappear, and then suddenly this becomes political. People have to turn to the state, and the question becomes whose incomes, whose security gets shored up, and whose is not. Who turns out to have been bearing the risk, right? So around this time, my co-author Beck was delving into Facebook forums for mom and dad investors, right? There's landlord forums, public on Facebook. And you could go on, I mean, this is at the point when everybody was freaking out a little bit, and it was kind of sociologically interesting to take a look at what people were saying, right? And property investors were freaking out like everybody else. And, as you'd expect, this is a time when people were starting to realize that they simply wouldn't be able to pay rent for a little while in a lot of cases. And you can find some statements of fear and loathing from landlords around that time about their own tenants. You can find a little bit of well-meaning paternalism. One landlord shared about how they were going to offer toilet paper from their private stockpile to their tenants, for example. But mostly sort of anxiety about, most property investors are doing it on, with the mortgage. They're they're relying on the rent coming in to pay the bank. So there's a lot of anger, a lot of, anxiety. So for example, I'm sorry, but as a landlord, how am I supposed to absorb that loss? How do I pay my mortgage? If it was for 3 months, they'd never be able to backdate it when they start work again. It'll cause a flooded market because we have to sell. Unless the banks write off 3 months worth of mortgage payments, then the banks will crash. Impossible situation. Landlords have already taken a hit on house prices. Doesn't the community realize that if landlords lose these houses, there's going to be a lot of empty houses, a lot of people homeless? And then people saying things like, so they can strike on rent, but can we strike against the banks about mortgage payments? No. So it was, there was a lot of realization wherever you were relying on flows, which had suddenly become, very uncertain. It was a very strange economic crisis, right? Historically very unusual, right? Because instead of being about, caused by an initial shortfall in demand because of a financial crisis or because of, something happened to commodities prices, it really started differently, right? It didn't begin with a slump in demand. Instead, it begins with a direct shutdown of a lot of activities. And then if that's left unaddressed, it would have a flow-on impact to the rest of the economy. So some of the early takes, were struggling to find historical parallels. So we heard, it's like, some people, it's like World War I. It'll be over by Christmas, hopefully. Or it's like World War II. It calls for instead of total mobilization, total planning for total demobilization. We have to plan so that people can stay home for a few months and then unfreeze the economy at the end. Alternatively, it will be like the Great Depression in reverse, right? So with the job losses coming first and financial collapse coming afterwards. At the time, so around last March, the OECD put out one of its early projections, and they calculated that shutdowns would directly reduce GDP by somewhere between a fifth and a third of GDP. So that's direct, in those direct sectors directly shut down. And then of course, that would lead to a sudden precipitous drop in income in those sectors, which would then feed into cascade through to demand shortfalls across the whole economy. So all kinds of businesses would shut down in the absence of a policy response. There'd be, mass unemployment. People wouldn't be able to pay rent or mortgages. Millions of people would be homeless. Banks would collapse, et cetera, et cetera. We'd have a deep depression even after, a vaccine arrives and the pandemic is over, as we thought at the time. Now, we didn't get that. And I think it was probably politically impossible for us to get that. It is astonishing, it was astonishing to a lot of people how quickly ideology about balancing the budget went out the window, and also how technically easy it was to finance what has turned out to be an unprecedented, enormous fiscal response. But I think, it's not that surprising because it was up against an even stronger ideological force. And that was just the widespread panic across all of society, from top to bottom, at the possible evaporation of income, whatever the source was. So what we got in Australia was a very real shoring up of aggregate demand, right? So I think that was real. I'll talk about that in a second, and I think Ben's going to go into some more detail. But I think what we also saw in Australia was a willingness to let the costs of the pandemic fall on a number of groups who happen to be in unfortunate situations, right? So on the fiscal policy side, so thinking in aggregate terms, it was a really big deal. So that the public deficit for Australia for 2020 to 21 financial year across state and federal budgets, the cash deficit's projected to be about 14% to GDP. which is huge. I mean, much bigger than anything. I think bigger than World War. I mean, certainly given the size of the public sector, much bigger than anything World War II. In World War II, certainly much bigger than any deficit since. And real household disposable income actually rose substantially during the pandemic. So private incomes fell, consumption certainly fell, but once you factor in the transfers, disposable household income actually rose. Business profit also rose during the pandemic. So businesses made more profits in the aggregate in 2020 than in 2019. Again, thanks to the large public spending of various kinds. And the adjustment, in terms of unemployment was blunted here compared to a lot of places. And of course, we were hit a lot more lightly by COVID than a lot of places, especially in the Northern Hemisphere. In the US, the labor market adjustment happened almost entirely through job losses. In the UK, they had a public wage subsidy, sort of more comprehensive than we have here, and there was very little initial decline in unemployment, but people's hours fell. Australia was somewhere in the middle, right, with JobKeeper. But of course, JobKeeper excluded a lot of people. It excluded casuals who hadn't been working for longer than a year. It excluded employers whose turnover didn't quite meet the cutoff. And the job seeker safety net, even though it was, substantially augmented by the special COVID payment, excluded a lot of people as well, so especially migrant workers. There was also very little editing of contractual obligations. So there was a lot of talk about that this time last year, right? Were we going to give people a rent holiday? Was there going to be a legislated, regulatory mortgage holiday? In the end, that was pretty much left to private negotiation, where people's power was very unequal. The banks let a lot of people defer mortgage payments, but of course, it would add to their debt. Rent, in most cases, could be deferred, but most people still had to end up paying rent or were running up arrears. The other big thing that's happened, even though employment has rebounded to some extent, the jobs that have been created have been quite different in a lot of cases from what was left. So most of the jobs, I think 60% of the new jobs created May to December were casual, right? So the impact of the pandemic on working people was very different depending on what kind of contract you had. And the jobs that we're coming back with are much less secure. Women have been disproportionately affected because of the industries they're concentrated in, because the burden of extra care work when the schools closed tended to fall disproportionately on women. And also there's been a substantial increase in the gender pay gap. A report from the Center for Future Work recently made very clear. And of course, we see the government now rushing through this new IR law, which sort of reinforces everything that left people vulnerable during the pandemic, right? So on the one hand, we saw quite a substantial overall fiscal response that kept that circular flow of incomes ticking over to an almost surprising extent. But on the other hand, I think the impact on people's security at work has been affected in a major way. And even people in more secure contracts, I'm sure are certainly true of the universities. We're under constant pressure. We're told, we've got enterprise agreements coming up. COVID is being used in a big way to put pressure on people to say we can no longer afford security. But I think that, and I'm just going to finish with this and hand over to Ben, and I think we'll start, deal with some of this in more detail. I think what the response has shown is that, that huge increase in the public sector has shown that we have the capacity to insulate people from even, I lost the mic, even very big sudden downturns in income. But we have the capacity, but it's a political question how that's spread, And I think for those of us on the left, those of us in the labour movement, our job is to really push home that question, because we can afford security, but we're going to a situation where job security, security of income is even more under threat than it was before COVID hit. I'll leave it there. I got some more things, about what we could potentially do, but I'll leave that for questions and hand over to Ben. Thanks, everyone.
Let's go straight to Ben. As I said at the outset, Ben Spies-Butcher is the head of the sociology discipline of the Macquarie University, a great Australian political economist, very active in the Greens, and a particularly astute analyst of social policy. Ben, this is not working.
It's got a button on it that's an on-off button.
Yeah, it's got an on-off button that keeps going off automatically. It's a bit like government policy.
It's possible I pushed it by accident, but I don't think so.
No, it's just constant.
Does that work? No.
Yeah, it's on flight.
Yeah, it does. Okay.
Just check if the button, if it's light's not on, press a button.
Yeah, I think it is.
I've got more batteries.
Let me try.
You want to try it?
Yep.
Going to briefly, I might just wait 5 seconds for batteries.
Can I just announce next couple of weeks away, the next one. Does anyone see my schedule? I've been trying to get it up on the. Has anyone got a schedule here of what's coming in 2 weeks' time? I should know. I left it on the table. Disappeared somewhere.
Stephen.
Oh, sorry, that's right. There isn't one.
Stephen, can you hear me?
Okay, Easter. Okay. 2 weeks after that.
Stephen, can you hear me?
You read it out.
Hello. Hello.
So nothing.
Okay. The next one is West Papua: The Invisible Struggle for Freedom with Kemi Webb-Gannon and Ronnie Karenni.
That's it. That's going to be fantastic. Thank you for reading that out. Yep.
20th of April.
20th of April. That's a very important one. Thank you. 20th of April. Please put that in your diary. He did. They did. Let's put them in my pocket. Oh, I've given them to him.
Wonderful.
All right.
Well done, everyone. Thank you very much. So, am I okay sitting down here?
Yep, that's fine.
That's all good.
For me.
So thanks very much for having me back at Politics in the Pub. This is one of the most important political institutions in the city, so it's wonderful to be here. So thanks, Frank, for the introduction.
Do you want to introduce yourself again briefly?
Yeah, so I'm Ben Spies-Butcher. I'm in the Sociology department at Macquarie University, and a while ago was on the Committee of Politics in the Pub some many years ago. So it's lovely to be back, and it's lovely to be speaking alongside Mike, who is, I agree with Frank, one of the most important Australian left intellectuals going around at the moment, and has been doing an extraordinary job with Jacobin, which I really encourage everyone who isn't already subscribed to subscribe to. A very important centre of progressive thinking. So I want to pick up where Mike left off and think about these very odd circumstances in which we came to half freeze the economy, half speed it up. And I want to focus particularly, I suppose, on the political opportunities that potentially provides for us. I think they looked initially really bleak. They then briefly looked wildly optimistic, and I think most of us have been quietly lowering our heads and assuming we're going back to politics as normal, as much of the stimulus that was introduced has been gradually unwound. So for a brief moment, after I think almost a decade of a extensive political struggle to increase our unemployment benefit, a Conservative government decided to double it overnight. decided to suspend unilaterally virtually all mutual obligation, to radically weaken the partner test, which meant that people who lost their job, who have a partner who's in work, were able to actually receive it, which is extremely difficult given the way the partner test works. We got a wage subsidy scheme that Australia's almost never had. We decided to make childcare free, briefly. All these things happened in what was, quite a remarkable series of changes. And I mean, going back, casting your mind back, not only were we struck by how rapidly the onset of this kind of catastrophe happened, and all these things in our lives shut down, and people in Victoria, or particularly in Melbourne, were shut down for weeks on end, but also how these announcements kind of, came one after the other. It was almost like every second day you had a just radical announcement by the Prime Minister and the Treasurer announcing billions of dollars that were going to be spent that they had said weren't needed only a few days earlier. So there's something quite remarkable about the set of circumstances that lead a Conservative government that has been dedicated as its primary, let's say it's got two things it's been campaigning on for the last 20 years. One of them we might say is variants of racism, but the other one is fiscal constraint. That is, that the government shouldn't extend itself beyond its means. It shouldn't spend money, and we should, if anything, lower taxes rather than increase them. And it is that government that had been steadily trying to close down refuges, scrimping and saving tiny amounts of money out of every social program there was in order to be able to claw its way back to a budget surplus before the next election. Remember, that was the entire politics after the last election. It was that government that decided to introduce the largest stimulus in Australia's history. It's just pretty stunning that that happened. So I think it's worth thinking through why on earth it did happen. What on earth possessed these people who clearly don't believe in any of these things to do that? What happened? And so a large chunk of it is that there was a crisis that did actually affect everyone. Madonna was kind of right. Even the very rich and powerful were going to be subject to this crisis. And it's no surprise that, the first waves of it coming into Australia came from Aspen, I think, as people migrated back from their winter holidays. But it is also that complex web of payments, which increasingly mediated by banks and by the finance sector, has linked everyday expenditures on where we live, on how we heat our homes, on our telephone bills, and on our childcare payments, have increasingly linked those to very complicated financial products and to the underpinnings of the finance system. And so there was this real dilemma. How is it that you stop people moving but keep money moving? Which was essentially what they were trying to do. Yeah, so we couldn't stop the money for the reasons that Facebook group of landlords made very clear. People were absolutely petrified about stopping the flows of money. And so petrified, in fact, that our banking system did unilaterally decide to suspend everyone's mortgage payments, anyone who asked. And in fact, even at the moment, more or less, the bar is not much above currently above just asking for your mortgage payments to be suspended. Now, of course, they add on to the bill, but the bill also changed radically because interest rates, which have been in long-term decline for a while, also fell through the floor. So despite that enormous increase in government debt that took place in Australia, the biggest increase really in Australia's history, our public interest bill is lower today than it was before the crisis started. A public interest bill is fallen despite the massive increase in debt because of the collapse of interest rates. So something weird is going on. We also had this very odd situation where people could anticipate that there might be a collapse in the most important market of all in a town like Sydney, which is, of course, the housing market. So people all apprehended that that might happen, but no one really believed that it necessarily would happen. And so we didn't really ever see house prices fall. We did see a substantial fall in rents, but by suspending all of those payments, we didn't force people into the position where they have to sell their properties. And now, if this had been another kind of crisis, people would have sold their properties anyway, right? One of the reasons that people sell their property is because they think the house prices might be falling now, but they're going to fall even further in the future. So I better get out now while I can at least cut my losses, yeah? But no one thought they were really going to fall, which is why no one sold their house, yeah? As long as they weren't forced to by the bank, everyone just held tight. In fact, so confident were people that we could probably withstand the crisis that the moment that incomes started to resume as normal and people would start turning up to auctions, first home buyers flooded into the market, much as they did after the GFC, and house prices have started going up again. Why? Because people anticipate that in the future, they'll rise even further. And so those first home buyers, better get in quick, cut their losses, pay extra now so they don't have to pay even more into the future. So there's something very weird that's gone on with the flow of incomes, with our apprehension of what's going to happen, and in how governments manage this crisis. And there are a couple of opportunities that I think that has presented us with, and they haven't been properly realised yet. But let's imagine that we start to win, we organise, we mobilise things and so and go, well, what might that look like? So the first thing I think is that we started to refocus on social needs, on what it is that people need in order to be able to just live together. So we started to define essential work in terms of people who do things for other people and that are really helpful, that feed them, that give them care. They were seen as the most important tasks, and the associated transport and other things that are related directly to that, to feeding people, giving them care, to making sure they've got a roof over their head. We valued those workers briefly, we valorise them, and there clearly is an opportunity to be able to mobilise around that and talk about why those workers deserve, I think we've lost it again. There you go. No, I've got it back. I'll keep pushing the button. So we have an opportunity to be able to talk about why those workers deserve. It's okay. I might give up and just keep talking. Is that okay? Can people hear me up the back? My apologies. So I think that was particularly starkly seen in our sector, in the university sector, where one of the interesting things that happened, the kind of tragic but potentially powerful things that happened, was that the people who actually teach everyone were about to all get sacked. So the casual workforce, so the university had built this model where they knew it had this exposure to risk from international students not coming. They knew they got lots of money from it, but they knew that that was a risk. And so they said, that doesn't matter. We can deal with that risk because we're only going to employ everyone on casual contracts. And if we lose the money from the international students, we'll just stop employing all the casuals. So that was the immediate plan. Then they discovered that, in fact, the need for teaching increased. It didn't decrease as we tried to move everyone online. So it wasn't possible to just not employ any of the casuals because they were the ones who were teaching everyone. So they had to keep on paying them, and that started to cause, at least temporarily for a number of universities, quite large deficits. But alongside that, the other thing that had been happening in universities, which is that people at the very top had been both multiplying in number and massively increasing their salaries, started to come under at least some renewed scrutiny. And there was a discussion about how it was that the people who seemed to be doing this very important work, and in universities that was the casual tutors, but in hospitals we had healthcare workers, we had the people who were in Deliveroo, who were risking their lives, often getting killed without any form of insurance in order to be able to deliver food. Childcare workers, how is it that all these people had poor pay, poor conditions, and yet seem to be completely essential? We have an opportunity to be able to build on that, to be able to keep that story going and talking about that, and to be able to talk about why it is that people who don't seem to do any of those things get paid quite so much. We also got to see, as Mike said, that governments can do all sorts of things that we never thought was possible, and virtually overnight. Strangely, poverty in Australia fell last year. It didn't increase. Now, for some groups of people, extreme forms of poverty increase, particularly for migrant workers. So the people who are completely excluded from JobKeeper and JobSeeker, experience very extreme forms of poverty. And one of my colleagues has been involved in a study of international students, which, showed, effectively depression era, on the breadline, lining up for food handouts every day, living in radically overcrowded accommodation. That kind of nightmare scenario was entirely reality for a minority of people in Australia. But for many others, homelessness fell. It seemed that, having talked about how complicated homelessness was, how difficult it was to solve, how entrenched it was, how governments couldn't really do anything, within a matter of weeks, there were virtually no people left rough sleeping, and a series of new arrangements put in place for other forms of insecure housing. Not all adequate, but homelessness fell precipitously. Poverty fell precipitously. At the top end, so we wonder, production fell, right? Fell radically. So the amount of stuff we produced fell. The amount of stuff being consumed by most people at the bottom of the income ladder was increasing. That is, suddenly people who are on New Start were able to afford the medicines they needed. They could afford fresh food. So their real consumption increased for a whole range of people. So how do we square the circle? What happened? If we were producing less and all these people are consuming more, what happened? Well, the incomes of people at the top were often rising, and certainly their wealth was increasing. So we saw the wealth of people like Bezos and the captains of industry skyrocket, but their consumption levels fell dramatically. Why? Because they couldn't go to the opera, they couldn't fly to Aspen. Like, we physically shut down forms of conspicuous consumption. And as a result, we had a real redistribution of consumption from the very top to the bottom and the middle. That really happened. We showed it was possible, and we can keep doing it. We did it with government spending less on interest payments at the end of the beginning. So we have some exciting possibilities. Now, our government was never committed to that. And our government, and I'll wrap up on this, was always committed to phasing out the temporary social democracy that Australia implemented. And it has been doing that quite successfully, unfortunately. At the beginning of this crisis, writing something that Frank put together a special issue along with David Primrose on the COVID crisis, and I optimistically said, look, it's very easy, it's easy to tolerate for governments. It is easy to tolerate poverty and homelessness. It's very hard for them to directly be seen to introduce those things. It's been really hard for a Conservative government, after 8 years of trying very, very hard, to wind back Medicare in any substantial way. And it really did try. Remember the co-payments and it's really hard to do that. So optimistically, I thought, if we really do radically reduce poverty, if we really do radically reduce homelessness, surely it will be hard for any government to consciously and deliberately reintroduce poverty and homelessness. Unfortunately, it's turned out that this is quite a skilled government at being able to consciously and deliberately do those things, as it has already done in one round and is planning to do at the end of the month. But the debate has transformed. If we went back a year and a half and people said, look, we know we've been campaigning increased New Start, but will a Conservative government do it? No one would have thought that was possible. I don't think anyone seriously thought that was possible. We've had a very disappointing increase, but a Conservative government has permanently increased New Start by $25. We've had a Labor government a Labor opposition that is now committed to saying that it thinks that payments should be above the poverty line. That is a much more substantial increase that it is lining itself up for than would ever have seemed plausible in the last 2 or 3 years, even under a much braver opposition under Shorten than the one that we currently have. And we now have currently in Canberra a real push on based around increasing payments to at least $80 a day, which has got mainstream attention, is getting a serious mainstream debate, which is way above what ACOS or any of even the advocates around anti-poverty work were campaigning against 18 months ago. if we look over to the United States, and I'm not sure if people have been following what's been going on with Biden's stimulus program, but I think we can look and see what a government that is trying to use this moment to reset the rules rather than to do it temporarily and take it all away, what that might look like. And very soon, the stimulus package that's passed will mean that most poor households with children in the United States will be at least $7,000 a year better off. Child poverty is about to halve in the United States, and poverty overall is about to decrease by a third, almost overnight. Now, some of those measures are still temporary, partly reflecting the politics of trying to line up around the midterms so the Democrats can campaign on winning something. But I think it does outline that there is a real program of talking about social needs, of reprioritising the workers that actually directly give us the things that allow us to live decent lives, and which say that government shouldn't be subject to arbitrary fiscal constraints that mean that it's acceptable to say that people should be allowed to starve because governments shouldn't run up a deficit. And that politics, I think, is under threat. And everything we can do to tip it over the edge, everything we can do to say the United States has just outspent Australia, even in GDP terms, and they're fine. There is absolutely no problem with us spending more money. And that spending really does mean that people live better lives, and we really are reducing poverty. That's a real choice, and we demand that you make it. We have set up to allow that to happen. And I hope that possibly over the next 12 months, we're going to see a politics that allows some of that to happen in Australia too.
Thanks, Ben. And thanks, Mike. It's now time for questions from the audience. Who'd like to begin? Yes. There we are.
Thank you. And thank you, the speakers. This looks like we seem to be in a similar situation, but better than almost 100 years ago in the Great Depression, where John Maynard Keynes came out with a more radical model than what was presented by the neoclassicals. It couldn't solve the problem. And my question really is, isn't it about time we question the very mathematics of the models that we talk about? Because I've been studying Henry George myself. And the deeper I study Henry George, and the more mathematical I look at it, the more he makes sense, even more than John Maynard Keynes, because he captures one thing that other economic models can't, including modern monetary theory, including Keynes himself. It's economic rents. It's a synergy of society that's produced, that belongs to no one individual, but to everyone. The reason why we managed to not have a housing crash was because we allowed the homeowners to preserve their economic rents, when it could have been an opportunity for the government to swap debt and restore the government's role in providing public housing for all. Because right now, I've seen a serious problem outside Sydney, where right now I've seen boomers selling their homes in Sydney to settle outside of Sydney, drive prices up and drive rents up, and threaten to create a whole new class of homelessness in the countryside, when that could have been avoided. So that's my basic question. Isn't it all time we redesign the mathematical models themselves? Thank you.
Gentlemen.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, I don't feel competent to comment on George in particular. But on Keynes, I mean, one thing I would say is that it's not just a change in ideas that we're looking at since the Great Depression. I think in some ways that comparison is useful, because what we've been through actually, I think, is a massive historical event that will be looked back upon for decades. But one thing that I would say is not so much that the ideas have changed, but also that the size of the public sector is just so much bigger than it was in the 30s, right? And so that is a huge element of what happened in the last year, is that even though, you know, I doubt anybody in the Morrison government considers themselves a Keynesian, even though I still think that, you know, macroeconomics has become part of the common sense of policy making. But it's because, you know, we've been through an unprecedented stimulus, in part because the public sector is just so much larger relative to GDP than it was back then. On the land stuff, I fully agree that there's a lot to talk about what's going on with house prices, what's going on with the ability of people to derive incomes and wealth from asset price inflation, essentially. I don't feel qualified to comment on George in particular, but I think it is an important thing to talk about. And Ben, do you want to pick that up?
Just briefly, I mean, yes, taxing away rents, which is the essential George's position. So this is unearned income just from your control of an asset and resources. I think a shift in that direction is certainly one that is both going to be good and going to be required by the ecological transition that we hopefully are going to have. I don't think it's necessarily the only part of that story, and I think it's important to reinforce what Mike was saying. It's not just the change in ideas. In fact, while people might not formally accept modern monetary theory, it's pretty clear that there's some pretty innovative monetary policy that's now being completely accepted by policy elites around the world. But that only works in the interest of everybody when there are powerful political movements that force governments to do things. And if there aren't those powerful political movements, it doesn't matter what the ideas are, they will keep on doing what they're already doing. So, you know, in that light, I mean, I think a lot of the shift that's taken place, we saw the opening up of space from COVID, but encourage anyone who's not already connected to the Australian Unemployed Workers Union. They're the guys down in Canberra at the moment demanding $80 a day. And I think they have been a really big part of being able to shift the debate. And that is just as important as the ideas.
Sorry, just something occurred to me, just if you don't mind it. There's a really great book on has come out in the last year by Brett Christophers, British/Swedish geographer / political economist, Rentier Capitalism, and I think that he really makes a good case. He has the best analysis on the importance of rent, not just land rent, but rent, all kinds of rents, including, you know, intellectual property, the rent that you get from monopolizing a particular public service, natural resource rents. I think if people want to get into the political economy of rents, I think it's a really great book. And one of the points that he makes is, I mean, there is something different about residential real estate. And that is, unlike all of these other forms of property, which tend to be very highly concentrated, land, you know, residential real estate is something that, you know, that broad upper half of the income distribution feels that they own houses, feels that they have some particular stake in, which makes the politics of it extremely difficult. Anyway, I'll leave it there.
Other questions? Yeah.
Ben, you mentioned two words that stood out to me. One was scrutiny, the other one was, last year I noticed that we were trading officially unemployment around 7%, but when you factor in things like JobKeeper, where people are paid but actually do nothing, it's a health issue. But when if we had information that said, for example, total unemployment was more like 20% rather than 7 or 8%, that distortion of information, is that actually playing to the games of these master craftsmen of pretty much bastardizing social equity for political gain and also distorting economies? What do you think on that? And secondly, in regards to the real economy, last year and even now, apparently the stock market has been at record levels in both Australia and America, and yet lay people, if you use the crude term from the US, Wall Street has been having record profits, and yet Main Street lay people have actually been feeling the real pressures of what's been going on the last 12 months in particular. And sometimes that may actually mask true poverty rather than absolute poverty. So could you comment on, in terms of this recalibration or readjustment of where we can go from here, do we need to start focusing on other factors? For example, with political pressures that are now happening in Canberra, that's actually started to shift in getting to the realms of, say, business, economics, social equity, the environment. Are those the sort of things that are going to become far more important and have to be measured and looked at on par with economic models to be able to have a broader and more realistic picture of what's going on from here on in, rather than what we're doing up until now, which seems to be a very narrow band of statistics that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense if you're outside the economics realm. Could you comment on that, please?
Yeah, completely. I mean, there's a lot of numbers we talked about that, you know, don't seem to quite make sense. And I encourage you to read Mike and Beck's piece in Jacobin. One of the things that they say there is it's really hard to reduce people's standard of living without them getting angry. Yeah. And so we've had this myth that we have reasonably low unemployment for a long time. But at the peak of this crisis, the government had to admit that underemployment was skyrocketing and that people didn't have enough money. And that's because lots and lots of people were suddenly affected by it. It was reducing their real standard of living and making lots of people angry, and that has real political effects. So absolutely mobilising around that real lived experience of people's lives getting worse. That's about to happen. It is already happening for lots and lots of people. And giving people ways of being able to understand why that's happening because of decisions that politicians are making, not because of things that they're doing. And being able to have a collective response to that says there's an alternative to do this. I think that is absolutely central to how we are going to do this. This has to be about people's lived experience, not just about the numbers. I completely agree.
Yeah, just really quickly, if I can say on that, yeah, the underemployment question is a really good one, and I think obviously underemployment in terms of, you know, not people losing their jobs but losing hours certainly went up much higher than unemployment. My understanding from the data that's come out recently is that it's actually come right back down again, right? So most of what's left of unemployment is actual change in jobs rather than hours. So the hours have been much more flexible than the jobs, but absolutely that was a big deal. And on the other side of your question, the asset side, I think is a very interesting one as well. The fact that the share market and also house prices, as Ben talked about, have remained high throughout and rising through all of this. I think that it goes to show that, and I think that it's certainly true that stimulus, when money goes up, it certainly does. I mean, there's nothing keeping people from putting it into their wealth. And I mean, we saw that in Australia, that overall, for example, mortgage repayments actually accelerated under COVID in the aggregate. So even though some people were having a lot of trouble meeting their mortgages, there was that phenomenon of a lot of people who were, you know, working at home without much to spend their money on, but receiving their normal salaries. People put that money into their offset accounts, and so that, you know, was, you know, mortgage repayments were happening at very high levels. And I think I read a story today in the States about the number of people in the US saying that they're going to put part of their stimulus checks into day trading on the stock market. I guess it's another part of the phenomenon. There's nothing stopping you from doing it. Yeah.
I think we've got time for perhaps 2 more questions. Is there any women who would like to ask a question? We're getting a bit. Yeah. Oh, okay, go for it.
Hello. I'm also learning English, and I couldn't understand that much conversation because my listening completely. But I don't question or my statement. I just want to say, like, I don't know how many people knows about pandemic visa. I'm on visa, pandemic visa. It's the visa, backpackers, tourists, and working holidaymakers stuck in Australia can apply this visa to remain in Australia. And I chose to remain in Australia because I don't want to go back to my country because it's not safe. It's safer than Australia. And I needed to apply, I needed to prepare lots of documents to apply this pandemic visa. And this visa need me to work in a critical sector in Australia, like care work, hospital job, and food processing, and farm job. Because lots of people, lots of like farmers and hospitality care, disability people, aged care, need workers, but not enough workers in Australia. But because lots of backpackers go back to their own country. But I wanted to stay in Australia after the pandemic happened, so I chose to remain in Australia. But it was a bit hard to prepare the document, everything, like bank statement, blah, 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 everything, to apply this visa. And compared to New Zealand government automatically extend the visa to everyone, like working holiday. But Australia government require lots of documents to like extend. Otherwise, you can go back to your country, or you need to do critical work to support Australian economy, and they require higher tax, very high tax to pandemic visa. And I met lots of people in a hostel. I was keep seeking critical sector job because I was care worker in Japan, and I wanted to find a care work in Australia, but I didn't have any qualification or certification in Australia, so it was so difficult. But I found a job in the factory, food processing factory, and I'm waiting for work permission from immigration now. And the point is, lots of backpackers want to go to New Zealand as soon as possible to escape from Australia because they don't want to pay high tax and like doing like modern slavery job in a farm and factory. I can totally understand, and I also want to go to New Zealand because it was my plan to go back to New Zealand, but the flight was cancelled because of COVID. So I chose to remain in Australia, but the government do like this kind of stuff to the backpackers and working holidaymakers, tourists, and the family of the these kind of people. So lots of people like struggling to get a visa now and need to find a critical sector work. And this is the situation. Yeah. So I want to just like want to be visible.
I mean, what can you say to that except it's disgusting, really. I mean, it's another example of what Ben was talking about with the people who do the teaching, most of the teaching at a university, right? And we realized during the pandemic how necessary the work was. We're very reliant on that work. And yet, in the aftermath, in the sort of return to normal, they don't care. They're willing to just, leave people in exactly the precarious condition that they began with. It's terrible.
Yeah, they abandoned the fiscal constraint, but they never abandoned racism, unfortunately.
All right. Thank you very much for your contribution to the discussion. I think that's really extended the dimensions of what we're considering to very important social questions about how we relate to people who are visiting from other countries. Yeah, go on. Okay. Cameraman's option.
Yeah, very quick. Well, I'd like to say that this is very
characteristic. We went to the immigration officers, David Coleman office for over a year, every week for a year. We couldn't get to see him once. I contacted the Reesby paper, which is the Torch. They wouldn't report it. This was great. And some of us were constituents in that his electorate, which was Banks. And like, who knows this? Who knows about you? Well, thankfully, you've spoken out, and we all do. We all know about that. And this is something someone should really take up. So thank you. Look, I'm going to get some t-shirts made. My first one was, I was thinking of where have all the political t-shirts gone. That was the first one. But the second one, I think, what came out of your talk for me was this. It's from 1968. We're also having a badge made, by the way, where of the three athletes on the dais at the Olympics stand up and be counted. But the T-shirt, I thought, should be forced from 1968, I think from France, Paris, in that year. Be realistic, demand the impossible. What do you think about that?
I mean, while we're talking slogans, there was one thing I cut for reasons of time, but my favorite slogan of the pandemic, I think, is one. There was one by the artist Ian Allan Paul, who made up a face mask riffing off Marx, where he says, a pandemic isn't a collection of viruses, but a social relation among people mediated by viruses. And I think that's the whole point of what we're talking about, really, is that the effects of the virus, the vectors were social and economic as much as they were, literally viral. And we had, what Ben and I both said, I guess, is that we've shown that we have choices about what can be done, political choices. We've shown the capacity of things that can be done, what seemed impossible. And it's up to us, I suppose, to make the case for, to prosecute that and not allow a return to back to normal politics.
Yeah, and I love the slogan.
I want to just read it. I live in Campbelltown. I can talk to. I just wanted to reiterate what the woman over there was talking about with the idea of social visibility, and how much COVID-19 has amplified that. Working as a community worker, I'm finding it very difficult to do projects in the last year or so. Very much so because the people that I'm supposed to be coming to work with have gone to ground. So I have a personal and professional interest in seeing what changes, what remains the same. I do wonder upon how much of that can happen through social policy, how much of that can happen through social movements. It's been a very inspiring week, particularly with women's efforts to expose some of the underground stuff that's happening at the political class. I feel like there's a lot of that stuff that can be uncovered, and I think that comes through social movements rather than social policy. So I'm wondering where there's some clarity between both, and I'm hoping I'm not drawing up a false dichotomy here, but I feel like there's some dedication to be made if we are to make sense of what's going to happen into the future, and also at the risk of being effective soothsayers and what the future is going to look like.
A bit of soothsaying is always good.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that exactly, it's going to be movements that determine where we go to from here. And it was extraordinarily inspiring with all the people in the streets yesterday. But that comes out of a kind of moment of crisis, right? The awful things have been allowed to happen for a very, very long time. And there is a moment when we get to see just how awful they are. And we need to use that to be able to change things. I think we also see just how hard it is to change them even in those moments. Just how strongly the political class and the media class stick together to be able to prevent change. So it's going to be really hard. But if we can mobilise people, then I think some of the positive changes, responses that we saw through COVID can be brought back and made permanent. But that'll only happen if we get lots of people in the streets and lots of people active.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think it's incredibly important for, I mean, so much of what's going on in, well, I don't even want to say the margins, but I mean, really large sectors of Sydney and elsewhere in the country. You know, I have a mother-in-law and other family members working in social work who tell, you know, routinely tell stories that you wouldn't believe. And, you know, I think it's important, you know, the actual you know, fallouts from economic ups and downs, and even just the ordinary workings of the economy that we never hear about. I think it is extremely important to make those, bring them out, and to take every opportunity that we have to get that out, and yeah, I mean, feed it into proper, you know, effective social movement. Absolutely.
We've got time for one more question, I think, from over here.
Actually, it's very brief. What I wanted to say is a bit of comment and then a question, and actually I think it connects a lot with what I think has just said. So earlier you said that the government almost overnight made these huge changes, and that was very surprising. But I think it's all very important to note that part of that necessity to act was to do with the union being involved with those decisions about how to deal with and what kind of extra money had to go into everybody's lives to keep things moving. And now, I mean, that worked for a very short time, and now the government, federal government, is really attacking working people's rights and working conditions. And as you just answered, I think is going to come back down to people being very active in going to the streets or contacting prospect centres, all kinds of things. And would you like to comment further? But I think that's, you know, the government could take those actions briefly and then very soon after, because that's not who they really are. It is actually very important.
I want to ask you your question before you go.
Yes.
It's a quick one.
Yeah.
From marking measure. Thank you very much. Gentlemen, thank you very much. I came here to listen and to learn. I'm always doing that. Look, I do have to run, but I'm a little, I understand most of what you said, but neither of you mentioned the word productivity. And I think that's pretty important. I probably come from the other side of politics to some people in this room, notwithstanding I have a very strong social conscience. You know, we have an obligation to do our best to look after everybody. I certainly believe that. However, productivity is important because if we're going to be paying all these people who can't work, unable to work, don't work for whatever reason, someone's going to have to produce to afford that. And I guess that was my only question to you both. But as I said, I'm here to listen and learn, and I thank you.
I mean, I couldn't agree more with you about the importance of unions at the moment. Having been through a fairly brutal year in the university sector, I think we both have, and you know, but I actually feel like in the university sector and other areas as well, we made a difference in the last year, absolutely at different levels, but at the political level in terms of arguing for particular, well, fighting back against some of the worst possibilities, but also I think it's very important for people to fight not only at the policy level, but also in their own workplaces to defend their conditions. I think one of the things that Beck and I said in our piece last year is that whatever happens with the political response, organizations, whether we're talking about public sector or quasi-public sector like universities or large firms, actually still had, there was a lot to play for, and there were still a lot of organizations were opportunistic and are continuing to be opportunistic about the effects of the pandemic. And I think that there's, the policy realm is very important, but I still think there's a lot to be played for at individual workplaces. And of course, the combination, like we've got to push back against what the government's trying to do now with the omnibus bill as well. On the productivity question, I mean, very quickly, I think it's true, but in a situation where demand, we're risking losing, or we have lost huge amounts of private demand. The worst, the absolute worst thing for productivity is a fall away in demand. I mean, it makes resources go to waste. People's capacity to work goes to waste. So I think the very first thing is to get demand up and running, make sure people have the incomes to buy things. And I think that is very much the first thing that we should be focusing on. Because in the absence of demand, while unemployment is still very high, people's capacity to work and the means of production are going unused, right? So I think that demand management is absolutely the biggest thing for increasing productivity at the moment still.
Yeah, and thank you for the question. Thanks for coming along and listening. Really appreciate it. That's great. I think on the productivity question, I completely agree with the stuff on demand, but I think it's useful to know that not only, so the US reform is modelled on a Canadian change that happened under Trudeau, which also substantially reduced child poverty, actually one that the Hawke government implemented here as well. And it effectively created a basic income for kids. And the evidence on that is now in, and that had absolutely no effect on preventing people from working. In fact, it led to people working more, not working less, and led to much better outcomes for kids, which means that they're much more likely to be productive workers in the future. And that's partly because there's a whole bunch of problems generated by poverty, which are bad for productivity. And creating at least a floor for people and doing so efficiently by making sure that people at least have enough money without lots of bureaucracy around it is quite an effective way of doing that. And the final thing I'll say, thank you very much for the question, is if you haven't already emailed the crossbench senators about the IR bill, you should. It's in the Senate now, and it potentially is about to make all the problems of casual work worse. So please let them know.
Thank you. And a final comment from me on productivity. I think the question and our experience under COVID means that we have to think more broadly about productivity. It's not the same as profits. It's not the same as contributions directly to gross national product. There's a broader concept of social productivity. What is useful? What are the necessary underpinnings for a good society? Some of that care work that our speakers were talking about earlier needs to be heavily valued. A lot of unpaid labour is very productive in the sense of keeping our capacity to improve our general well-being as a society. So I think this is what we've learned from COVID. Thank you very much indeed. Of course, finally, I have a couple of pleasant wrap-ups. One is, of course, to announce that our next session of Politics in the Pub in 2 weeks' time is on the challenge facing the people of West Papua. This is a very different, so 4 weeks' time, my apologies. There's an intervening break. 4 weeks' time, at the same place, hopefully, and we'll be having a rather different kind of discussion about intense and ongoing problems in that neighbouring country to the north. Philip? Sorry, okay, yep.
Very quick one to thank Kathy Bogan, especially for the behind-the-scenes technical stuff, which she's put a lot of time into, which she reminded me of when we stuffed up earlier on. So thank you, Kathy. And Peter Murphy, who also came on and set everything up. That was fantastic. And the two audience members, all the audience members, but especially Christine and Kit. Many, many thanks. That was absolutely invaluable. And also, I can't let it pass before saying on Fridays at the Town Hall steps, 5 p.m, is both two demonstrations. There's the Free Assange one, which they're always very inventive and creative and musical and brilliant. And there's also the Refugee Lives Matter on the other side of the steps. And the Assange people have actually occupied the Town Hall steps and taken them back and not let the council get in the way. In fact, it's brilliant. And we would like, actually I would like, what they have in Madrid, refugees welcome on the Town Hall, because it's actually part of their policy, which they're keeping a very good secret. But we will persuade them of that. And I think that's all. Thank you.
A plug from me, since we're talking about events, we might also talk about books. The latest issue of the Journal of Australian Political Economy, the biggest issue ever produced, is on the biggest challenge I think that we face, along with creating a healthy and sustainable society, and that's creating a democratic society. It's a special issue with a whole lot of articles about capitalism and democracy. Have we come to the parting of the ways? Obviously, the Trump phenomenon is what brought that into people's mind. But this discussion, I think, tonight, which has been very profound, I think also raises questions, not just about the nature of the problem, but about the political processes by which we may find a way forward from here. So, in winding up, let me thank you on your behalf to the two speakers, Ben Spies-Butcher and Mike Beggs, and thank you all and good night. Sorry about that. It was just a joke.
We're well practiced.